Good evening, everybody. This is Jeff J. Brown, China Rising Radio Sinoland in Shenzhen, just south of the Tropic of Cancer. And today I've got a wonderful interview. Max Parry interviews on China Rising Radio Sinoland. Take that, evil empire, past, present, and future. Pictured above, Max Parry visiting an anti-Soviet KGB museum in New York City. Introduction. Max Parry is an independent freelance writer, journalist, and geopolitical analyst. Originally from San Diego, California, he has resided in New York City for over 10 years. His articles have appeared widely in Counterpunch newsletter, The Unz Review, Greenville Post, the Center for Research on Globalization, Dissident Voice, Off Guardian, Mint Press News, Zero Hedge, Popular Resistance, Sign of the Times, 21st Century Wire, Souverain Media, which is French, and more. And my takeaway is Max is a great writer of articles who really has a knack for getting the background on every piece he writes. He knows the importance and relevance of the historical perspective and always does his research as far back as needed to really frame the subject. Enjoy and learn while reading this written interview. Want to read more about Max's work and give him a shout out? On the article here on China Rising, which you can get also on the YouTube and SoundCloud channels, is his email, his personal blog page, Facebook, and Twitter. My question number one, tell us a little bit about yourself in the present, your upbringing, and how you became aware of the evils of empire. Young, older, slowly, and epiphany. And Max's answer to question number one is, I was raised by old lefties, so I had the advantage of becoming aware of the evils of empire very early on in my life. What really solidified my worldview and awakening was coming of age in the Bush era and experiencing the political aftermath of 9/11, which for me was truly the American Reichstag fire and then the Iraq War. It started with reading Chomsky and Zen, and when I discovered Michael Parenti, I was truly ready to go all the way down the rabbit hole. There was no turning back after that. My question number two. In your excellent, well-researched article on Yugoslavia, you wrote that the International Criminal Tribunal, the ICT, case against Slobodan Milosevic was established in violation of the UN Charter. Yet they went ahead, tried, and convicted him, right? Or was he only tried? In any case, how did an illegal court get that far? Also, is there a difference between the ICT and the International Criminal Court, the ICC? Max's answer. Although it was completely ignored by Western media, Milosevic was actually posthumously exonerated of responsibility for war crimes by the ICTY. Unfortunately, it was in 2016, many years after he died under mysterious circumstances while on trial in The Hague. I suspect he was murdered like many believe about Hugo Chavez and Yasser Arafat. In the trial that convicted Radovan Karadzic, it showed Milosevic and he were actually frequently at odds, and there was no evidence that any ethnic cleansing by the Serbs was being directed from Milosevic and Belgrade. As for its legality, the ICTY was a kangaroo court put together by NATO as a tool of Western imperialism from the very beginning. In fact, the ICTY was established simultaneously with and even before most of the alleged crimes it ended up prosecuting had even occurred back in 1993. How can a court be established to prosecute crimes in a war that was still ongoing? It was all part of the facilitation of the war itself and the breakup of a country where the Bosnian heroes and Serbian villains were pre-selected. The same sort of judicial body was created by the UN Security Council for Rwanda's so-called genocide, where another inter-ethnic civil war was exploited and politicized. Just as many Hutus were slaughtered as Tutsis, but who knows that in the West? Meanwhile, the ICC will never bring any member of the Bush administration to court for the Iraq War, or the Clinton administration for bombing Serbia for 78 days straight, for that matter. The U.S. has no regard for international law. Just this last week, Trump's Secretary of State Secretary of State Mike Pompeo threatened to bar members of the ICC from traveling to the U.S. and face financial sanctions if they proceed with an investigation of Israel and its crimes. The U.S. and its allies are free to commit atrocities with impunity while creating ad hoc tribunals to condemn those that defy them. Good answer. My question number 3. I wrote a scathing article about the International Criminal Court, the ICC, being a finger puppet for Western Empire, pointing out that Milosevic is the only white person to have been tried there for war/crimes against humanity. Nations are pulling out of its charter, and dark-skinned countries are cynically calling it the, quote, International Caucasian Court, end of quote. They seem to have a good point. Not to mention that when Serbia was NATO bombed into oblivion, it was socialist, a strong ally of Russia, and is also Orthodox Christian, each an unforgivable sin in the eyes of the Imperial West, and Milosevic was the poster boogie/straw man for all this. No one from the Americas has ever been tried, and the U.S. openly says it will never let it happen, even to the point of using extortion. One ICC judge just resigned because of blatant U.S. threats to the members for investigating Yankee crimes in Afghanistan. The ICC is clearly a hollow joke, a Western puppet, a perverted charade. Why haven't all the nations of the world outside of Urangloland not left the ICC charter? And Max's answer. I firmly believe the Cold War never really ended if you look in retrospect at the West's geopolitical moves since the Berlin Wall came down. The breakup of Yugoslavia and the war on Serbia, as you know, it was Russia's ally, was part of the expansion of NATO, which on paper no longer serves any purpose since its formation was for the stated purpose of containing the Soviet Union and communism. Now NATO has contained Russia, even though it is under free enterprise. The U.S. neocons in the American Committee for Peace in Chechnya brought Wahhabist separatism to the Caucasus during the 1990s. Who ended that conflict? Putin, which is one of the reasons he has drawn the ire of the West, in addition to rebuilding the Russian economy, subduing its hegemony in the Middle East, and assisting targeted developing countries in the global South, including Venezuela at the present moment. The new manufactured Cold War is just an extension of its predecessor. Had he been in power instead of Yeltsin, the war on Serbia would likely not have gone the way it did. As for the ICC, international law does not apply to Western elites. The U.S. has explicitly stated it will not recognize any court that would indict Americans for war crimes. As George H.W. Bush said after the U.S. shot down Iran Air Flight 655 back in the 80s, quote, I'll never apologize for the United States of America, ever. I don't care what the facts are, end of quote. My question number 4, what do you know about the story of Bill Clinton's psychopathic Secretary of State Madeleine Albright confronting Milosevic in person, telling him he had two choices: let NATO occupy Serbia or prepare to be bombed into oblivion, and he refused such humiliating terms, banking on Europe not cannibalizing one of its own. Surprise! Some people see Clinton's use of nuclear weapons in Serbia as the inception of the United States', quote, end of history thrust for global full-spectrum dominance. I could go back to Alexander the Great in 300 BC. What are your thoughts on all this? Ah, yes, it was the Rambouillet Accord. She gave the ultimatum that Serbia had to give up its sovereignty or face the onslaught of, quote, humanitarian bombs, end of quote, and it was the last vestige of Eastern European socialism remaining. She followed through on her threat, unfortunately. What a nice way to repay the Serbs who actually saved her family during the Holocaust. My question number 5. You wrote an article about conspiracy theories and rightfully pointed out that the CIA came up with the term to propagate in media propaganda to dispel citizens' doubts about the lone gunman hoax for JFK's very public murder. But I think it goes much deeper than you suggest. I wrote in my book China Rising that Gallup has done poll after poll since 1963, and a majority of U.S. citizens has always believed the government was involved in Kennedy's death. Ditto Martin Luther King, Junior's murder, now a majority believe it was perpetrated by the government, thanks in large part to William Pepper's very heroic work and grand jury that convicted the feds/military. He is also doing the same thing for RFK's murder, another obvious frame-up. For me, it was not until 2010-2011 that I came across the video of World Trade Center Building 7 collapsing in free fall, a massive skyscraper that was officially, quote, untouched in 9/11. I'm a certified science teacher and know that the universal laws of physics cannot be suspended or ignored. It started my long and shocking research into false flags, and in China Rising I completely dismembered the official propaganda for 9/11, Charlie Hebdo, and Boston Marathon hoaxes. I kept following them and was mortified at how amateurishly they can be done, like Bataclan, Nice, Las Vegas, and all the others, yet still brainwash the masses. But our elite owners know they can trick us into believing whatever they want to serve their capitalist imperial agenda. They really know how to manipulate Homo sapiens, evolutionary group survival, mental processes, our ability to compartmentalize cognitive dissonance, obediently submit to collective amnesia, and genuflect to leaders' dictates. You also wrote about the many CIA, MI6, Gladio Army false flags in Europe to destroy popular and political support for communism. Need I say more? I don't bother researching them now since Western false flags are so numerous and predictable, but journalists like Kevin Barrett continue to do fine work exposing their hoaxes of empire. I grew up in Oklahoma and belatedly learned that the Oklahoma City federal building bombing was another blatant false flag. Then, just in the last year, I read Dave McGowan's must-study Wagging the Moondoggie. I laughed so hard at myself I almost peed in my pants that I could have been such a dupe for 50 years. But again, being a scientist, I knew Mr. McGowan spoke the bitter truth. With all of my experiences in what all of my experiences in research have taught me is that Western empire cannot survive without the crowd control and brainwashing effectiveness via the endless acid drip of false flags. They put the sheep in sheeple. I know you just wrote your article on conspiracy theories a few months ago, but in the interim, have you reflected further on false flags and the role they have on humanity's stage? Max's answer: I think the so-called, quote, war on terror, end of quote, has become a global enterprise with a business model. It has become a self-perpetuating machine. Something like terrorism really happens randomly and infrequently, yet the rate at which attacks are occurring all over the world today shows that it is being manufactured on a global scale, not just with the exporting of Wahhabism around the world from Damascus to Xinjiang, but domestically here in the U.S. It has a financial incentive to do so. How can a war on terrorism be fought at the cost of billions of dollars per year, which has only increased international terrorism exponentially? How can these attacks be escalating with the amount of panoptic surveillance around the entire world? And of course, I've always had my suspicions about 9/11, from the ominous predictions in, quote, rebuilding America's defenses by the Project for the New American Century, to the Carlyle Group and bin Laden family being flown out of the country before commercial airspace was even reopened. Take, for instance, the mass shooting phenomenon. It's no coincidence that the FBI has increased its use of unethical sting operations which prey on mentally unstable individuals on the political fringe, be it Islamists or white nationalists, who are then coaxed into committing acts they likely may have never done otherwise. They even facilitate the weapons and cost, one would assume, in the hopes they will be caught beforehand and entrapped. After all, if there were not enough terrorism to fight, it would have to be manufactured in order to meet their business model and its quotas. For example, there are regularly headlines where plots were thwarted. Unfortunately, I believe they also frequently go wrong. It's funny you mentioned the Oklahoma City bombing. I just recently watched the documentary called A Noble Lie. I think many of these attacks, like the Oklahoma City bombing, were either sting operations gone bad or even allowed to happen on purpose in order to increase Homeland Security funding and the rolling back of civil liberties. Time and time again, the fingerprints of Western intelligence agencies are found all over these events. Even this most recent mosque shooting in New Zealand bears all the hallmarks. I would not be surprised at all if it turns out to be another sting operation gone wrong. For one thing, the perpetrator's travel activities are extremely curious for someone we are supposed to believe is a white supremacist, like visiting North Korea and Pakistan. He fits the Oswald profile of a patsy and fall guy in a larger operation. I watched the disturbing full video of the shooting that was taken off social media. In my view, he was clearly a militant and trained professional. Or look at the Orlando shooting where Omar Mateen, the gunman, was in an FBI sting operation for an entire year prior, and afterward everyone assumed it was a hate crime because the target was a gay club when he had selected it randomly because it had little security. On the Boston Marathon bombers, who were already on the FBI's radar and even radicalized by the Jamestown Foundation's sponsoring of radical jihadists in the Caucasus, I think a lot of people on the left today are unfortunately hostile to questioning the nature of these events because they have swallowed the anti-conspiracist Kool-Aid. Many leftists might be willing to rightly believe that wars abroad are started with false flags, from the Gulf of Tonkin to the Syrian gas attacks, but what about here in the U.S.? It's no different in my view. They also have a tendency to reduce the causes for these events into the false paradigm of the two-party culture wars. Sorry, a, quote, crisis of masculinity, end of quote, is not the only reason mass shootings are happening. I think there is a lot more going on than that, and it is a reality most are unwilling to confront. Excellent answer, Mr. Parry. Question number 6. In this same article, you talk about the mainstream media playing a key role in the effectiveness of false flag propaganda. I love your comment that, quote, it is always the people who are blamed for the media's failure to do its job, end of quote, and quote. That is to say, the Guardian regards a view generally held by most rational people with an accurate understanding of life under capitalism as a conspiracy belief equivalent to racism, end of quote. I was not surprised to learn in my interview with Terry Malloy that French and British spy agencies paid the Italian press to publish propaganda articles in support of Italy joining in World War I, as well as the British press starting the government's orchestrated propaganda campaign to go to war as far back as 1910, 4 years before World War I's outbreak. There is a great book called The War Lovers about how Teddy Roosevelt, William Cabot Lodge, and William Randolph Hearst worked hand in hand to plan a war, decided not to attack a British colony to steal some of their plunder, but opted for Spain instead with the false flag of the USS Maine in Cuba, getting U.S. citizens baying for dark-skinned blood and imperial conquest. Mr. Malloy reported on how the Lusitania false flag was used by Woodrow Wilson to renege on his pacifist campaign pledge to keep the United States out of World War I, then sending 10,000 troops to die in the Soviet Union to fight against Lenin's newly installed communist government. How long do you think our elites have been able to use false flags and propaganda to manipulate the people into war and totalitarianism? World War I? Can we go back to the Crusades? Ancient Rome or Greece? It seems like Western citizens don't stand a chance at understanding the truth. And Mr. Parry's answer to the above, question number 6, I believe one of the earliest records of a false flag incident was in a war back in the 1700s between Sweden and Russia, where the Swedes disguised themselves in Russian military uniforms and staged an attack on their own troops. The government assembly had been unwilling to go to war with Russia prior to the incident, and afterward the King of Sweden was able to convince them to start a war. It was truly a Gulf of Tonkin or Lusitania, centuries ahead of its time. Question number 7. You just published an article on Russophobia and using Edward W. Said's book Orientalism as a backdrop, which was outstanding. Your delving into critical historical perspectives is very necessary. I learned the term Overton window, that being the limit of discourse on the range of ideas that the public will accept. I really appreciated how you dug into the racist aspect of your Anglo-land's foreign, quote, policy, end of quote. I just interviewed Boris Merman, and he wrote about the, quote, American werewolf complex, end of quote, meaning that U.S. citizens always have to have a, quote, dreaded other, end of quote, to demonize. From Native Americans to Africans to Irish to Italians to Germans to Jews to Slavs to Latinos to Muslims, the litany is seamless. Robert Williams Jr. wrote the wonderful book Savage Anxieties, The Invention of Western Civilization. In it he cataloged in detail that this vision of foreign monsters and beasts goes back to prehistoric Greece, where everyone and everywhere outside their boundaries were man-eating, godless, and/or demonic, gigantic, and/or grotesque, horrific, evil, mentally retarded, sexually deviant, and lazy, unwilling to till the land, make things and be productive, quote, people, end of quote. According to Williams, these paranoid pathological justifications laid the foundation of what I call Western civilization's 6 E's of racism: expansionism, extermination, expropriation, extraction, enslavement, and evangelism. In Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's sobering and revealing book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, she wrote how the English perfected their model of colonial, quote, total war, end of quote, which is the old standby, kill all, burn all, destroy all, by adopting the methods of terror used during Europe's medieval crusades to Palestine. She later talked about how American elites found that it was the poor Scot-Irish immigrants who made the best soldiers for total war on Native Americans because they were so infused with the Christian covenant of manifest destiny, their punitive, hardcore Protestant strain that took no prisoners. Putting all this together, I had an epiphany that the prehistoric Greeks got their paranoia, pathology, and monsters from the Old Testament/Torah, which is full of the 5 E's of racism, and a very angry, violent, jealous, vindictive, petulant God. Abraham was from Mesopotamia, which, with the epic poem Gilgamesh and King Hammurabi, was the source of many Old and New Testament stories and miracles. All of the Old Testament's incest, parricide, matricide, fratricide, rape, genocide, murder, monsters, demons, and sexual deviancy are all fully expressed in Greek and later Roman mythology. Am I onto something here? I just developed this idea over winter vacation when I went back to the U.S., and to inoculate myself from the American dream, read Dunbar Ortiz's book, as well as Eduardo Galeano's Open Veins of Latin America. Mr. Berman averred, saying he looked upon the Bible/Torah as simply a morality tale, which is a good ripost to my thesis. Please share your thoughts. And Mr. Parry's answer to this one is, Open Veins of Latin America is one of my favorite books, but I'm no biblical scholar. However, a lot of what you're saying reminds me of the first chapter of Peter Joseph's Zeitgeist series of films, the Egyptians and Greek zodiacs containing 12 signs. Number 8, my question. You comment a lot on Marxism. Are you a Marxist, communist, member of any political party? If you are any of the above, please tell us about your inspirations and perspectives. Answer. I am a Marxist-Leninist and a committed communist. Unfortunately, I am not a member of any political party, as even the ML parties in the United States, who are otherwise solid, are heavily invested in identity politics and dividing the working class on cultural issues, which in my view is anti-Marxist and counterproductive. They refuse to engage the majority of apolitical working class people in the United States, many of whom are now being spoken to by a growing far right that resonates with their grievances. Fundamentally, I believe the left in the U.S. is still residually damaged from the effects of COINTELPRO. Overall, it is still hindered by an excessive preoccupation with privilege / lifestyle / identity politics, anarchistic amateurishness, and disorganization, and most of all, a hostility towards any kind of leadership in favor of pluralism. Wow. Question number 9. What projects do you have in the works? Do you have a book up your sleeve? And Mr. Parry responded, I am currently working on another piece on the historical misconceptions surrounding the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the Spanish Civil War, and how they are the basis of the, quote, red-brown, end of quote, smear being hurled at several journalists I admire. The work of, namely, the Irish journalist Angela Nagle, who authored a fantastic article entitled The Left Case Against Open Borders, as well as the popular anti-war blogger Caitlin Johnstone. Both of them have been the subject of unfair attacks, and the piece is a defense of them and others like Glenn Greenwald, Max Blumenthal, Michael Tracy, and other figures who've been smeared for appearing on Fox News and Tucker Carlson. I also have a potential opportunity doing freelance work for an alternative media network. Nothing is certain yet, but hopefully it will materialize. I plan to build my own proper website as well. Stay tuned. And then, the last question. Number 10, I asked, please recommend some of your favorite books, authors, and websites. And Mr. Parry closes out by saying, Michael Parenti was a huge influence on me, as I said before, as far as geopolitics and history go. He was always the most consistent politically in terms of understanding empire and communism. Many Western leftists in the Chomsky mold seem only able to accept that the U.S. is an imperial nation if they can believe Russia and China are somehow on an equal scale of evil simultaneously, which is their inner social chauvinistic talking. Parenti doesn't have these political confusions. John Pilger is another person whose work I greatly admire as a filmmaker, journalist, and politically. Of course, I can't go without mentioning Lenin's writing because it's so crude, caustic, and uncompromising. I recommend the usual suspects like Consortium News, Max Blumenthal's Gray Zone Project, Black Agenda Report, Global Research, etc. Thanks for the fascinating questions and interview, Jeff. Thank you, everybody, for listening to this recitation of my interview with Max Parry. Please share and with everybody in your circles and social and local circles. Please make a donation at the top of the of this page, as it costs us a lot of money to keep this site from being attacked endlessly by nefarious hackers. Good evening. Bye-bye.